Kimberly, what's going on?
Hey Dave, how are you?
I'm good. I'll tell you what, I was telling you before this, and I really mean it. I love these conversations we have because every time we have them, I walk away with two things. One, having my mind blown just by the stuff and then going, I need to study more because she can absolutely go circles around me. So
Yeah,
it's always good
nice.
to have you on. It really is.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm excited to be on. I've just felt this a sense of urgency just to basically just share what I've learned, especially about the women of the restoration. Just because I feel like their voices are being silenced and they're being misrepresented, and in many cases they're being slandered and defamed. And I just it's kind of heartbreaking to me as a woman, especially as I look to the women of the Restoration to, they're as role models essentially.
Sure.
So I mean, I look to them to know what it means to be a woman of the covenant, what it means to be a woman of faith, and learning about their lives and who they are, just as individuals has just really strengthened my faith. And just to see that there's this conversation going on out there about the historical practice of plural marriage, and then everybody wants to talk about women, but they're not actually listening to what they ever said, if that makes sense.
I was thinking about this today, this very thing. It wasn't too long ago that we went through the Me Too movement, right? And you remember what one of the big rallying cries was for that, which was believe all women, right? And
Yeah.
now we have, in this case, firsthand historical data on what these early pioneer women had to say on certain topics, plural marriage being one of them. But for whatever reason, you can't believe those women, right? You're supposed to believe everybody else, but you can't believe those women because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? And I find that very fascinating that when I talk about the left, I'm not talking just about the political left. There is a religious left as well, right? And it's especially found its way into Mormonism of all branches. It's not unique to the LDS Church. And and so there's this idea of you got to believe all women, unless what that woman is saying does not fit the narrative that the left wants to push in this instant. Does that kind of make sense?
Exactly. It's like the women of faith. We don't want to believe those women, but any
Right.
woman who stands against purity, holiness, religion, we don't want to believe those women. We want to shun them, and in essence, that they don't just silence them, but it's just a fascinating phenomenon how how they say that women in religion, they're what's the word? I can't think of the word for some reason.
Subservient.
Yeah, subservient, or um they don't have, they
They're
can't speak for
oppressed.
themselves. And so then you have these women of faith who actually did speak for themselves, and we then say no, we can't listen to what they say. So
Right.
um oppression, that's the word I was looking for. So essentially we call women of religion, we call them oppressed, right? And but yet we're now oppressing these women by not letting them speak.
Right. No, it's an interesting paradox for sure, and quite frankly, a little hypocritical. So this will be great to get into because it's always good when you can get into primary voices, right? When I nerded out, better part of 20 years ago now on the founders and the Constitution, I was like, I want to know what those guys said. I want to see the argument, right? That led me to Madison's notes, that led me to other things, because so often we tend to look at history and even the best of us, I think presentism always creeps in a little bit, right? I think it's really hard to always filter that out. And so when you can get back to those primary voices and in the first person hear about what they had to say, I think it's enlightening. It shows what they were thinking and not so much what we think about or think they must have been thinking about. That was a word salad. Holy cow. So yeah.
Great. And so I just want to just preface before we get into it. So again, this podcast or this discussion is going to be about the women, especially those that live the plural marriage covenant. But before we get into talking about their statements or what they said, I just want your listeners to know that these women, they're so much more than just plural marriage. They're women of faith, they're women of they're of honor, of nobility. They were deeply religious. They were scriptorians. They knew the Bible. They had an understanding of the ancient covenant. They understood. Um, they pretty much understood like Hebrew, the Hebrew life. They were educated on the Bible. They understood rituals. These are just incredible women. So they are more than just plural marriage. And while we will talk about that and we will talk about their experiences with it and their testimonies, I just want your listeners to know that these are women are more than just plural wives.
Yep. Yep. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we you look at some of the stuff that Eliza R. Snow wrote. I mean, she would have rivaled any man of the day in her ability to put together words, poems, hymns, dissertations. I mean, you stack her up against anybody, and she can hang with them. And a lot of those women were very much that same way.
Yes. So these were women that actually did have the gift of prophecy, and they enjoyed gifts of the Spirit that I think that we think don't exist anymore, and to such a degree that they had power.
Absolutely.
And we'll get into that as we get into some of these women. So I don't want to like give it away all up front. But
Sure.
I also did want to preface because I am a woman and I talk to a lot of women, especially about the historical practice of plural marriage. And I just want women to know, especially those listening, that as a woman, I have empathy for those that do struggle to understand this principle or to understand why it was introduced. And I especially have empathy for women who just have this paralyzing fear of that, their future or their eternity is going to be plural marriage and that they will have no say in the matter. And I just want them to know, first of all, that that isn't the gospel of Jesus Christ. That isn't the character of God. He doesn't force anybody into relationships they don't want to be in. And so what I want them to take away from this, hopefully, is just to understand that these women, they chose these relationships and they acted with full on their full agency and with knowledge. They had actual knowledge of this practice, why God was asking them to enter into this order, and they did so with, like I said, complete understanding, um, and with a desire to be obedient to what God had required of them.
Awesome.
And so, again, as I talk to a lot of women, for example, I was at the Book of Mormon Evidence Conference about a week ago, and this woman came up to me, and she was just complete fear in her eyes. I was trying to talk to her about plural marriage. That was her big issue. She wanted to understand it, but she just couldn't even, I couldn't even get a word out, and there was just this fear that took over. And I was trying to explain to her that does not come from the Lord. So where is this fear coming from? The Joseph Smith Foundation has a motto that says facts fortify faith. And so I truly believe that this fear that women have come because they are given wrong information.
Mm,
And so I really do believe it's true that facts really do fortify faith. In fact, the prophet Joseph Smith said, um, he said that knowledge is power and he who has the greatest knowledge has the greatest power. And then he went on to say, a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge, for if he does not get knowledge, he will be brought into captivity by some evil power. And I really, truly have seen, and so I can stand as a witness of this. I have seen those who lack understanding and who lack knowledge and no fault of their own, that they are held captive by the devil,
Hmm.
especially over this principle. And I've seen it time and time again with these women and men too. And so I've watched as this anti-polygamy movement has grown, right? I've watched it grow over the last 4 years, like exponentially. And those in this anti-polygamy movement, they are in bondage. That is the only way I can describe it. They truly think that by believing Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, that they have been set free. I've seen so many of them say, the truth has set me free. I no longer believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist, but they're not really free. They are now in bondage to this new ideology, right? This new version of history. And it's become kind of like their identity in a way, if I could say that.
Right.
And and so with this new identity, they are now deconstructing their faith. They are rejecting their temple covenants and they're rejecting almost every other teaching and principle that was taught by the prophet Joseph Smith.
Well, yeah, and this idea of being free, right? Like I once heard someone say the truth will set you free, but it's going to make you miserable first, right? And certainly I can attest to that. As a guy who came into Mormonism cold, right? I didn't have anybody in my inner circle that was Mormon. My family certainly wasn't Mormon. But there was a moment at which I had to take a look in the mirror and go, I might be kind of a dirtbag, right? And then make those changes. And that's painful. And that made me miserable first, right? Now, the truth will set you free, but you have to contend with it, right? And that's one of the things I've said is that you have to wrestle with this a little bit. Um, but you're not really free if you simply give up an ideology that you struggled with that has its basis in historical fact and evidence and truth, and then you go to another narrative that is liberating or seems liberating or may even feel liberating for a while. But at the end of the day, you're still trading in that bondage, right? You're trading in the bondage of fear in this case, right? And because I sympathize with this too, and I'm a guy who lives the principle. Um, but I've seen it cripple people and especially our sisters with absolute fear. So they trade in that fear that bondage of fear for a bondage of a false narrative, and a lie is still bondage. And so you have to be able to be free, but you have to be free through the truth, or else it's a facade of not being in bondage.
Yeah, that's correct. And so, like I said, I've just watched this. It's just taking over and it consumes people to the point where, like I said, this anti-polygamy narrative becomes their identity and they literally cannot function unless they're constantly like
Mm.
I sometimes use the phrase that they constantly have to beat you over the head with it. Right.
Right.
It's brought up in you just any like LES Facebook group. There, someone always, no matter what the conversation is, that you see that you have this anti-polygamist man or woman. They'll come in and they have to turn the conversation around to be about Joseph didn't practice polygamy and it right. They just turn it. It's just the craziest thing. It's so interesting to watch, and it's actually kind of frustrating because you're like, can we please talk about something other than plural marriage and so it is it just becomes this identity and it's who they are. They talk about nothing else about then Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist and I just have to prove it to the world. And again, I feel like they are in bondage to Satan. They've pretty much now got their marching orders from the adversary because they have allowed the evil one to take over, right?
Hmm.
Like Joseph Smith said, if you reject any principle that's revealed from heaven, the devil takes power.
Yep.
Because they're not just rejecting this idea of plural marriage. What comes with it? Again, it's they're rejecting temple ordinances,
Yep.
temple covenants. They're rejecting other revelations through the prophet Joseph Smith. They're deconstructing every part of Mormonism that they don't like. So I see that there's a real danger in this, a spiritual danger. And so I just hope once again that if they just by just you know getting to know the women a little bit, those that entered into this practice, that I'm hoping it can alleviate some of those fears that women have,
Yeah.
and they can actually be um, proud of the heritage that they come from, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You did bring up an interesting point because I'd noticed the same thing. It's like I've always said, if you have to come and tear down somebody else's creed or where they worship or any of those other things, that tells me one thing, that you're not real secure in your own beliefs, but rather you have to tear down the others for it to work right. And there's also something I've noticed that's really fascinating, which is I think on a subconscious level, those behind this movement understand it cannot work unless it has a massive amount of buy-in from a lot of people, right? Because I think subconsciously there's this thought of if we say it long enough and we say it loud enough, the facts won't matter because people will just accept it. And so that's been the other insidious part of this that I've noticed is that it's not enough for somebody just to believe this or a group of people to believe this. They understand there has to be massive buy-in. And likewise, it's imperative that for them that they get as many people wrapped up into this as they can.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's interesting because I've watched Jacob Hansen with Thoughtful Faith, if you're familiar with him at all.
I am. Yep.
And he's trying to take on this anti-polygamy movement. And I've watched him go into certain groups of you know, the leaders in this movement. And he just asks historical questions. What about this? And I just love reading the comments. Well, I don't love it. It's kind of entertaining and it's kind of sad at the same time. You just watch them and all they can do is heckle. They
Hmm.
just whenever he brings up a really good historical point. What about this source? Or why did this person say this? It's then they just begin with the heckling, and they don't ever answer the question. They don't offer like a rational explanation. If
Right.
they offer any explanation at all, it's usually, oh, they were just towing the line, or oh, this was part of the rewriting of history, or these were, Brigham, part of Brigham Young's cabal, or, and
Hmm.
you're just like, this is not even logical. It's not rational. There's no reason behind it. This isn't faith promoting. Where is Christ in all of this? It's said insidious.
Yeah. Yep, it is. So, all right.
Yeah. Hey,
Awesome.
so let's get into it. So I just had to get that,
No, you're good. Now,
get that off of our chest.
do you need to share any slides or anything like that?
I didn't I was under the impression that this was just like a voice recording, so I didn't
Okay,
prepare slides.
no, that's just fine.
And
You're just fine.
I mean, I would have loved to have slides. I think that they're
No, you're good. You're good. Whatever works. Well, I'm flexible. So,
so before I begin, because so again, we're going to be talking about the women, right? And so
mhm.
and it's not just women saying, yes, I was married to the prophet Joseph Smith. We're going to be talking about what these women knew about the historical practice of plural marriage. So I just want to lay a little bit of groundwork that I think is going to be important as we get into these women's testimonies.
Okay.
So, in order to lay the groundwork, right? First, we're going to go back to Nauvoo. Joseph Smith is revealing in Nauvoo for the first time the concept of eternal marriage.
Hmm.
So for us, the church has been established for over 200 years. We've we grew up understanding about eternal marriage, but for this was a new concept. The first time learning about any kind of, marriage for eternity, families for eternity. So, anyway, does that make sense?
Yep, it absolutely does.
So just a new concept. So I just want, so just we need to go back and kind of put ourselves in their shoes for a little bit, I guess, is that they're learning for the first time just this concept of not only is marriage ordained of God, but it's eternal.
Right,
So revelation given to the prophet Joseph Smith taught that marriage was ordained of God unto man, and under the law of God, that relationship was to extend into eternity without end. So, in other words, those who are married by the power and authority of the priesthood in this life continue without committing the sin against the Holy Ghost, will continue to increase and have children in the celestial glory. So that's what they was being revealed to them for the first time.
right.
So again, we have the advantage of being immersed in this understanding as we were born in this covenant and we inherited this faith from our fathers. So we understand this concept. But for them, this was something that was new.
Yeah. And in some ways it was absolutely revolutionary because most Christian creeds of the time are operating under the assumption that what Christ said in the New Testament about neither being married nor given in marriage after the resurrection was the predominant thought. So this is radical revolutionary stuff, and I don't think that could be overstated as well.
Yeah. And that again, you said it perfectly. This was radical, right? This was new. They had to wrap their minds around it. And so I just want us, and even with our understanding that marriage is eternal and that the highest ordinance in the temple is a man and a woman are sealed together as husband and wife. Even with that understanding, I have noticed that even as saints, we are still very narrow-minded.
Hmm.
And I want to bring up this point because I even feel like before we can get into these women's testimonies, we have to understand something that I think is very important. So I hear so many people say, with all of the evidence, even with I can tell them Eliza Snow said this, right? She testified of her plural marriage to Joseph Smith, and I still get, but Joseph Smith didn't have any kids with anybody but Emma. And so, and I'm like, okay, here we go into this. How are we as Latter-day Saints, with our understanding that marriage is eternal, how do we come back with he didn't have any kids with anyone but Emma, so therefore he was not married with anyone with Emma? Because what is eternal marriage? What was Joseph saying? He said that those that are married by the power and authority of the priesthood in this life, they will continue in the next life to increase and have children in celestial glory.
Right.
So Joseph Smith being sealed to Emma and to all of his other plural wives, those relationships will continue into eternity.
Right.
And what will they produce in eternity?
Children.
Exactly. Right. And
Yep.
so for me, I'm sitting there going, okay, wait a minute. Joseph Smith is in Nauvoo in 1841, takes his first poor wife in Nauvoo in 1841. He's killed 3 years later. When did you in those 3 years, he's essentially he can't live with any of the women.
Nope.
When exactly did you expect him to be having children with these women?
Right.
And I'm not saying that there was no consummations of marriages because we know that there were,
Yep.
because women did testify. And I'm not saying there were no children. I'm just saying that this idea, if you this idea that you're so narrow-minded thinking he didn't produce any seed that we know of with anyone but Emma, therefore he couldn't have been married.
Right.
I just think I just want to just kind of squash that right now because That is a lack of understanding of what eternal marriage is. The purpose of it is that your life with your spouse continues into the eternity, and you will increase and have children in celestial glory.
Yep. I think it's important to note here too is that so often we make this assumption that Joseph has everything figured out at the exact moment that the revelation is given, right? And that's not the historical. Sometimes it is, but more times than not, that's not what the historical evidence points to. It points to a revelation will come. Joseph, just like we all do, will have more questions and go back, and there's a refinement of those revelations, right? More revelation is given, clarification is had, and those things are done. So there's a lot of those marriages that I've wondered personally, and this is just, the book of Dave, page 1, so huge grain of salt here. He's figuring this out in real time, right? And now to make that even more complex, he's figuring it out at the height of Victorian sensibilities, right? And this is going to upset the apple cart in all of Christendom. The stuff he's talking about is absolutely revolutionary within Christian thought. And so there may be a little hesitancy for Joseph to even I'm just throwing this out. There may be some hesitancy on even consummating some of those marriages up front, right? Because Joseph has to understand, oh, this has got trouble written all over it.
Are you ready for me to blow your mind?
Yes, yes,
Okay, so you said, and I think you're partially right, where you said that he's figuring this out.
right.
So, and obviously how to live this revelation in a telestial fallen world where you're being hunted by, um, anti-Mormon mobs, dissenters, I think was the challenge. But let me just blow your mind for a minute. Did you actually know that when Joseph Smith first received the revelation on plural marriage, the Lord actually revealed to him the women he was supposed to enter into that practice with?
No, but it wouldn't surprise me either. But yeah,
Okay.
okay, let me get some duct tape because I'm gonna have to like duck my
And
head
that's
together.
actually what I want to talk about. This is going to be kind of the heart of this discussion because again, Joseph Smith is revealing for the first time this concept of eternal marriage. So, like I said before, we have even with our understanding of eternal marriage or the marriages beyond this life, we still have a very narrow-minded view of eternity. What is eternity? Eternity has no beginning and it has no end.
Right.
So we have this in our mind that okay, from this moment going forward, eternity is going to begin. Joseph Smith is revealing eternal marriage for
Mhm.
the first time, so therefore I'm going to be sealed, and from here on out, eternally I'll be married to this person. But what Joseph Smith was actually revealing is that these relationships existed before this life.
Okay, I see where you're going. Okay.
And I just want to point out, um, so let's just start with um the first pro-wife, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner. And this is why I think listening to the women is important because if we had listened to what Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner said, we would have known that Joseph Smith knew who his wives were before coming to this life because she was actually the first woman Joseph was commanded by God to take as a plural wife. He actually was commanded in 1834 to God had commanded him in 1834, she is one of the women you are to enter into this practice with. And so, but he had gotten afraid at that time. Again, he's still trying to figure out how am I supposed to approach this Puritan Victorian woman that she needs to be a wife, right? And so he's figuring out how to approach her. So he gets afraid. And in 1834, he doesn't do it, right? He doesn't
Okay.
follow the command. And the next time he sees Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, she's married to Adam Lightner. And so in his mind, he's thinking, okay, then I guess I don't have to do it. There's nothing I can do now. But God is saying, nope, you still have to. Because so let's listen to what her version of the story, right? Her testimony. Um, like I said, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner was married to Adam Lightner when Joseph Smith approached her to become his plural wife. And in 1834, so this is Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner's what she wrote about this experience. So again, we're listening to the women.
Okay.
She said, in 1834, Joseph Smith was commanded to take me for a wife. I was 1,000 miles from him, and he got afraid. The angel came to him 3 times, the last time with a drawn sword, and threatened his life. Joseph made known to me that God had commanded him in July of 1834 to take me for a wife. But he had not dared to make it known to me, for when he received the revelation, I was in Missouri, and when he did see me, I was married. But he was again commanded to fulfill the first revelation or suffer condemnation. For I was created for him before the foundation of the earth was laid.
So he's obviously related this to her, and then she's received her own testimony of it. This
But
union that stretches back.
back. She
Yep.
says, I was created for him before the
That's an
foundation.
that's an interesting way of putting it.
Yep. And and so this is what she's telling. So have you ever wondered then what was Joseph Smith telling these women? What was that like? Well, again, you go to the women because they will tell you.
Right.
And and so again, I just want to the reason why I want to read these testimonies is because they do teach us about eternity.
Right.
They they do reveal to us the celestial family organization as it was organized before the foundation of the world. We sometimes forget that Joseph Smith is a restorer of all things.
Right.
He's not just restoring the gospel, he's not just restoring a church, he is restoring the a celestial family organization as it existed before this life.
Right.
Because that's what eternal marriage is, right? It's a celestial order. It's a
Yep.
celestial family order.
Yep.
Okay? So she goes on. And at first she says, I did not believe him. If God told him so, why did he not come and tell me? The angel told him that I should have a witness, and an angel came to me. It went through me like lightning. I was afraid. Joseph said he came with more revelation and knowledge than Joseph ever dare reveal. And then she said, Joseph said I was his before I came here, and he said all the devils in hell should never get me from him.
Wow.
So Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, she has an experience where an immortal being comes to her and gives her more revelation and knowledge than Joseph Smith ever dared reveal to anybody.
Whew.
So again, when we talk about these women and what I very much dislike is that in all the conversations of the women, there's a lot of inferring. Oh, the women, some of them, depending on who you're talking with, the anti-polygamists, they'll just say these women flat out lied. Okay, that's what they say. Then you have just even like historians or scholars that, you know, say the historical record is plain that he entered into plural marriage, but when you ask them about the women, they'll say they kind of also downplay that the women, and I've heard a lot of, historians and scholars say, why would the women enter into this practice? And it's, oh, they didn't know any better, or they were just doing it on faith, or they just, following their leaders. And
Right.
I'm like, no, they had knowledge. They had more knowledge concerning this practice than Joseph ever dared reveal to anybody. And in fact, Joseph Smith said that when the Section 132 was being copied, he said that that was only but a portion of the revelation that he received.
Wow. Whew.
So we don't even have everything that Joseph Smith had revealed, that the Lord had revealed to Joseph Smith. But when you read the women's testimony, that other portion was revealed to them either by God, by angels, by visions, and it just blows my mind. So when we read these testimonies, it's again, we're learning something about the premortal life. We are
Yeah,
learning that a marriage extended before we came here. And is that not a principle of the gospel? We learn in the doctrine.
absolutely.
Yeah, we learn in the Doctrine and Covenants that the same sociality that exists here will
Exist,
exist there. Well,
right?
if it exists here, didn't it exist before?
It has to. It has to
Right.
by nature. So let me ask you this. Do any of the women that we'll talk about tonight, and we don't need to skip to it, I'm just curious, do they ever tip their hand into some of that knowledge that's not in 132?
Well, right. Like I feel like again, I feel like right here that Mary
Right,
Elizabeth did. And yeah, we'll talk about that as we go. That's why I'm saying you go to the women and and like I said, the women for me are more than just plural wives.
right.
I started studying the women just because I wanted a role model.
Okay.
Like I said at the beginning, I wanted to know what it means to be a woman of faith. But in reading these women and their life's history and their life story, I gained an understanding of what plural marriage is, why God commanded it, and that's how I gained my testimony of it. That's why I defend it so ardently. I mean,
Right,
I'm a mainstream of the church, and we don't live plural marriage, and but I defend it ardently because I know that these women were commanded by God, and I know that they entered into that practice with, like I said, a full knowledge and understanding of what they were doing and why.
right, right. No,
And
that makes perfect sense. And it look, we'll talk about it later, but it's that kind of knowledge, and I won't speak for you. I'll ask you about it later, but it's got to help to clean up some of the fear that surrounds it. So, yeah.
right. And so she goes on and she says, so she said, I was not going to be still to Joseph Smith until I had a witness for myself. And so she describes and she says, so I told Joseph Smith I would never be still to him until I had a witness. Said he, you have a witness. I made it, and he said, you shall have a witness. So promising her, if you want your witness, you will have one. And so she said, I made it a subject of prayer, and I worried about it because I did not dare speak to a living being. I went out and got between three haystacks where no one could see me. As I knelt down, I thought, why not pray as Moses did? He prayed with his hands raised. When his hands were raised, Israel was victorious. But when they were not raised, the Philistines were victorious. I lifted my hands, and I have heard Joseph say the angels covered their faces. I knelt down, and if ever a poor mortal prayed, I did. And so she prayed, right? And she
Hmm.
receives her witness. She has an immortal being basically come to her, and like she said, gave her more knowledge than Joseph Smith ever dare reveal.
Wow.
And I think some of this knowledge is sacred, and so I know a lot of it that they don't reveal because it is sacred.
Right,
So it's this idea of if Joseph Smith didn't reveal it to us, they're not going to reveal everything that they learned, but they're
right.
giving us a witness that they did have that knowledge.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. So does Mary Lightner ever recant on any of her assertions in this?
No, and I'm so glad you asked that because it's so interesting to me that one of the other arguments that I hear them make is, for example, they'll say that the women said that they were plural wives of Joseph Smith because it gave them a prominent position in Utah. And if you know the story of Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, she actually lived in poverty in Utah. I think she lived in southern Utah. I can't remember it was Cedar City or St. George. So while we have like the prominent women like Helen Mar Kimball and Eliza R. Snow and Elizabeth Whitney and that had prominence and had positions of honor in the church, you have Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, who basically lived apart from these women. She's living in poverty. And when Joseph Smith III comes to Utah and sends missionaries, she basically writes to the women's exponent. We'll talk about that later. And she says, well, here, I just want, no one's asked me. I never got a chance to speak to Joseph Smith III, but here's my testimony, use it as you will. And
Mm.
so she recounts this testimony and she writes this in and she's like, here's my testimony, use it as you will. So there you go. Why? So if the reason they assign to the women of saying they're married to Joseph Smith is that they have a place of prominence, why is Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner living in poverty, not enjoying this prominence that other women enjoyed? Why is she still testifying of her relationship with Joseph Smith?
Especially in the Utah period, right? Because look, it's not scoring you any points with the federal government or the population at large outside of Utah to be a plural wife, right? So you've got to be really committed to this in order to do it, right? And I
Mhm.
don't see anyone wanting to ride that out through poverty, through everything that comes, unless you've got a burning testimony of this.
Right. Yep. And so, I- like, I really like that example just because she's also a controversial wife, just because she was married to Adam Lightner. And what's interesting is that, again, if you talk to Mary Elizabeth, what about Adam, right? And she said, and so she talks about Adam and she says, my husband did not belong to the church. I begged him and pleaded with him to join, but he would not. He said he did not believe in it, though he thought a great deal of Joseph. He sacrificed his property rather than testify against Joseph Hiram and George A. Smith. After he said this, I went forward and was sealed to Joseph for eternity.
Hmm.
So Adam Leitner is basically giving his consent. He's not a member of the church, and but he wouldn't testify against Joseph Smith. He never said, "Oh, he came in and took my wife." Nothing. Like I said, he gives his consent. He actually sacrificed for Joseph Smith, and so she went forward and was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity.
And I want to say this. This is interesting because a couple things I picked up on there. One, she mentions I was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, right? She doesn't say, typically when we talk about eternal marriage, especially in a sacred context, we tend to throw in two words today, time and eternity, right? All time and eternity. She leaves out that time part, which I find very interesting, right? Because I can only assume that that's referring to this temporal existence. The next thing I'll say is that it would strike me as odd that any man, much less a man who, even though he might think Joseph Smith's a great guy, obviously doesn't believe his doctrine though, is kind of okay with this arrangement, right? That tells me that there's people who are looking for the illicit there, right? Back to the question of why don't we see more kids from Joseph plural wives running around? Well, this would probably fall as to potentially one answer for in at least one case concerning the Lightners. So I find all those things very interesting.
Yeah, so she does stay married to Adam, obviously, and continues to have kids with him. And so
And he moves to Utah.
I that's a good question. I believe so. I think he died early on. It is interesting to note that she was worried about Adam, and there's a letter. So again, there are so many testimonies of women. We I just want to throw this in really quick. as I introduced this, what I was going to say about Adam, is that I hear a lot of the leading voices of the anti-polygamy movement, namely another woman who's very vocal, has her own podcast. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Oh,
Um,
excuse me, Tell Brady Stone. I'm so
right.
sorry. I got
So when you listen to her podcast, she always says the only testimonies we have of the women are the affidavits, and they are signed by they're not even signed by the women. Their signatures are forged. And that is the biggest fallacy ever because there are journals, there are diaries, there are hundreds of letters, dozens, because I've transcribed them. There are biographies, women wrote their biographies. We're going to get into the women's exponent, the women publishing their testimonies and their witnesses in the women's exponent. But there is a letter that Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner writes, and I want to believe it's to Eliza R. Snow. And she talks about how that before Joseph died, he actually sealed Adam to him as a son in the law of adoption.
interesting.
So, like we think of, well, poor Adam, but he's actually sealed in this celestial family organization now with Joseph Smith as, his priesthood head. And, you know, so
That is
hopefully,
fascinating,
yeah,
especially when we consider that he's not a member, right? Um,
right.
that is fascinating.
Because I think with the idea that one day he may accept the gospel and that
Right,
he would be sealed. He would be sealed to a family. That he's not just Joseph didn't just come in and take Adam's wife and leave him, high and dry. He's now sealed in this priesthood organization. Um, he joins if he decides to accept the gospel, and which I think he will, has Joseph Smith as his head, he will, be blessed to be sealed to a woman at some point. So it's not like he's left without a family. And I think that's important to understand too. It's not just Joseph Smith coming in and taking wives from other men. Again, he's restoring a family as it existed prior. And
yeah,
like he told it Mary Elizabeth, no, nothing can take you from me. We're sealed. We were sealed before we came here. We're husband and wife, right?
right,
We can take another man's wife.
right.
So technically, she never belonged to Adam.
Here's the other fascinating thing. I think another doctrinal insight here a little bit. And it's not cut and dry, but so often we say, well, this maybe this guy lived around Mormons his whole life. He should have known the doctrine. Is he worthy to have his temple work done? Well, here's a guy who is familiar with Joseph Smith, familiar with the doctrine, knows it in this life, passes on, and the idea is that he could still have his work done. And I find that interesting too, and should be a little nugget for us to carry forward as we go into temples and do vicarious work for the dead, that we don't know all the circumstances, right? There was obviously a circumstance there that prevented Adam Leitner from being able to accept the gospel in that time. But I think it maybe should show us that we maybe need a little more liberality in making sure that we take the right names to the temple.
Exactly. And I think Joseph Smith knew his heart, and
Right,
we don't know what circumstances prevented him from gaining a testimony in this life, but for sure I think on the other side he's
right. Absolutely. All right, good stuff.
hey, so I don't know how much time you want to spend on
I can look, we've done this before. I can go as long as we need to. You
okay.
get to tell me when it's time to shut it down.
So I'm just going to go through again. So I've chosen, now this isn't a comprehensive, right,
Okay.
list of women because like I said, there are dozens, and we've been left with the impression from leading voices like Michelle Brady Stone that the women only signed affidavits and they were fraudulent, and that's all we have. When in reality, there are so many things written and said by the women. And so this isn't comprehensive by any any means. I've tried to choose testimonies where it teaches us a principle or teaches us something about eternity that we can learn from, because I think that's the value of listening to the women and actually trying to go to the women to understand plural marriage.
Right.
Because again, if we wanted to know what Joseph Smith taught outside of Section 132 about plural marriage, don't you want to go to the people he taught it to?
Absolutely.
Exactly. And
Absolutely.
so who are the women he's talking to, or who are the ones he's talking to? It's
His wives,
his wives,
right?
right? The women. And I mean, we get a lot from Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, but I really think the women have it's just so profound what they shared with us.
Absolutely.
So I chose Lucy Walker Smith for a specific reason. She was a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and I think that just her experience of praying with real intent illustrates an important principle for all of us. So again, she's being taught the principle of plural marriage, and at first she's like, "This is not for me," right? Like she
Mm.
has, I think and that's what I love about the women is you hear like they make they make you feel seen and heard that, wait, these women had the same reaction as I would, right? Or
Right.
that I'm like, no way would I ever consider this. So she said, so as she's relating her experience, she said that, of course, she's being taught the principle, encouraged, you have to pray about it, go get your own witness, just like in any principle of the gospel. And she says, I felt I prayed sincerely, but was so unwilling to consider the matter favorable that I fear I did not ask in faith or light. Gross darkness instead of light took possession of my mind. I was tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable.
Mm.
So what do we learn from that experience?
Well,
She's
oh, sorry. I thought that was rhetorical. Go ahead.
no, that was a question. Go ahead.
To me, one of the things that really stick out to me are two. One, if you're going to ask a question to the Lord, you had better be sincere, right? You had better not come with any preconceived notions. And certainly I'm guilty of that from time to time. I think we all are, right? We all have desires and wants that we want to have fulfilled, but sometimes those that's not what's best for us. So when you go to prayer, when you go to ask for knowledge and that sort of thing, you had better be able to really make a good case and then be able to accept the answer that comes. The next thing that really jumps out at me is this idea of wrestling with things, right? Um, it wasn't a one-off thing. I asked, no, didn't like it, so I'm done. Continue to wrestle with it, right? I was just reading here the other day that the word wrestle and embrace are fairly similar in the Hebrew. And so as I've looked at the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, I was like, okay, so is that wrestle or is that embrace? Well, sometimes I think it's a matter of timing on that, right? Maybe it's you start out as wrestling with things that you later come to embrace as you gain more light and knowledge and more understanding on the subject. Those were the two things that jumped out at me.
Yeah, that's exactly. And that's why I wanted to share that because I think that's just this important principle of even in the Book of Mormon, when Moroni is asking us to pray, he says you have to pray with a sincere heart and real intent. And then so then Lucy Walker, so she shares that, and then she goes on to say, "Oh, how I prayed earnestly for a manifestation of the will of God concerning me. It was near dawn after another sleepless night when my room was lighted up by a heavenly influence.
Hmm.
To me, it was, in comparison, like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. My soul was filled with the calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of me, and I received a powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of plural marriage, which has been like an anchor to my soul."
Phew. Yeah. And then gets the answer that is the truth. Not what maybe not what she wanted at first, but the truth.
Right. And she even says that it was, what did she say? So first she's in darkness and she said she was tempted and tortured and it was made life undesirable. And now she's saying supreme happiness took possession of me.
Hmm.
And then she goes on to say, as I was praying this last time, an angel of the Lord appeared to me and told me the principle was of God and for me to accept it.
Wow. Wow.
Right? So again, we don't know. And so God, I am a firm believer that God never gives a revelation without reasons for understanding it. So I don't think the angel just said it's true, accept it. We know that at that moment she received knowledge from this angel.
Right. Whew. And what who if it's okay to ask, who is she exactly? Right? Um, it's one thing to read about this one instance in her life, which is super important. I don't want to downplay that, but as you were alluding to before, she's more than just a plural wife, right? She's got a story to tell. Who is she?
Lucy Walker.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, she when was she married to afterwards? Was she married? I'm trying to remember if she's one of the women that does testify that she consummated the marriage with Joseph Smith.
Okay.
And so we know that about her for sure. Um, I think she goes on to be married to Brigham Young. And why do you think that's important?
I think this is my opinion on why she marries Brigham Young. I think one, as has been stated, she gains a burning testimony of this. But I've often wondered at times if Brigham did not feel, because we know how Brigham felt about Joseph, right? Um,
Uh-huh.
that's his ride or die. He would go to the ends of the earth for Joseph Smith. And I think probably it was a way that Brigham could ensure her safety, I would imagine, on some level. Those are my
Mhm.
answers. She's got a testimony of it, and then Brigham wants to ensure her safety.
Yes. And also we know that there's quotes from Hiram Smith that said that um the principle of the levirate marriage would be restored.
Okay. And that would fall into that. Yep.
Yep. And she was actually, so I was just wanting to make sure I represented her well. I was just looking up. It says that she appears to be, now we talked about Mary Elizabeth Lightner was one of the first women God commanded for him to take, but of course we know that at that time he didn't obey at that time. But Lucy Walker was one of the first women that was taught the principle
Okay.
of the restoration of plural marriage. Let's see. Yeah. So she's again burning testimony. She remains faithful to it throughout her life. Again, so again, why would you marry Brigham Young? Why not now that she's a widow? If once Joseph Smith passes away, she's a widow. She could go out and have, you think if this was about romance, she could then go out and marry somebody
Right.
else for time. But she chooses to marry Brigham Young, and I think that it speaks to again this idea that she understands the purpose um, on a level that we don't even understand. Like I can't say what she knew because she doesn't tell us. All she says is that an angel appeared to me and told me that it was true.
Can I
So
ask you a question that may take us on a tangent for just a minute?
yeah.
Because you brought up something interesting, and I want to say this from the outset. I am a guy who believes that no man should arrange a marriage for other people. I think that that's only a recipe for disaster. But something that was said that you said in there, I think is super important. It's something I've been looking at a lot lately, especially since I have kids now of marrying age. And that is we look at sealings and eternal marriage now from a very romantic point of view, right? And I'm not saying that that's bad, but also I think there needs to be a longer view of this, right? You got to play the long game in it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think because of our the day and age that we live in, I think a lot of people want the notebook version Mormon style, right? Where it's this really super romantic thing. But I often wonder if sometimes we're not served well with that mentality, right? Rather, is this the person I'm supposed to be with? And again, I'm not for arranged marriages. Um, I parted ways with certain people over this issue because I find it so repugnant when someone else arranges it. But people, I think, as they pick a spouse, and something I've counseled my kids on, is make sure that you're playing the long game here. Look, looks fade. I've told my boys someday this is what you're going to look like. I hate to break it to you. This is who you are. So you better have something else in place other than just raw desire and romance in that place. Is that making sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I would just say too that I think that we also have a, I guess, a corrupted definition of what love is.
Yeah.
Like I don't think we understand what true love is. Like true love is sacrificial love. It's about laying
Mhm.
down your life for another person. It's about putting somebody else first, right? Um it's the kind of love that Jesus Christ has
Right.
for his
Absolutely.
church, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, that was it. That was my side tangent. That's one of the smaller
Yeah,
tangents I go on.
and this idea too that like you don't, like then people think, well, were these women then just stuck in these loveless marriages? And again, I think it's because it's about this sacrificial love. What they knew what this was designed to accomplish, and again, so why were they doing it? Was it so they could have like the romantic where we walk on the beach and we have, Sunday picnics, or you can have this eternal marriage where you obtain celestial glory. And I just think that we do not understand what marriage is like in heaven. So,
Right.
um, but obviously these women did, otherwise they wouldn't have done it because they
Absolutely.
did have a choice. And that's, I guess, what I'm hoping that we understand about these women. And
Ab
so Um, and some of these these women I shared just their testimonies.
okay.
Some of them are not as elaborate as others, but for example, Desdemona Fulmer. I chose her because I feel like she was a player wife of Joseph Smith, but I feel like if you understood her life before she became a member of the church, I think it's very important because she actually had similar religious experiences like Joseph Smith. For example, she was one that was actually searching for the truth like Joseph Smith.
Mm,
And so she said she began to read the Bible and then she received what she termed was a promise from the Lord that she would be saved in the kingdom of God. And so she then continued seeking. So she's like, I'm not going to join any church. I need to join a church or religion where this promise can be fulfilled. And so she said she continued seeking and she said, quote, I was looking forward to a time when the knowledge of God would cover the earth.
she used a couple of very key Mormon terms in there long
Hmm.
before she was a Mormon, right? This
Right.
idea of the kingdom, right? I mean, in Mormon, especially early Mormonism, that's a huge point, right? There is a difference between the church and the kingdom, so to speak, right? And so she's
Yes.
in that term, and she's talking about being saved in the kingdom. Um, the other thing is this idea of the truth covering the earth. Very. very reminiscent of things Joseph had said and prophesied about Mormonism. Fascinating stuff.
Right. And so we have to remember, again, these were women that were educated on the Bible. And so they understood this covenant, this ancient covenant. They knew these prophecies of the last days. They were not ignorant. They were actually so knowledgeable. And that's what I love about learning about these women, about how much that they, they are, I feel like these are like the women you read about in the scripture.
Right.
And so her testimony is quite simple. So that was her before. This was, so she continued looking. So then, we know she joins the church. She becomes a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and she just said simply, um, she testified that she had a night vision, and an angel appeared to her and told her that the principle is true. And so she said, having been convinced of the truth of polygamy, I therefore entered into that order. And that was all she gave us. But again, she had a night vision. We don't know what she saw in that night vision, but when God gives you a vision, it's
Yeah.
usually He reveals things to you that you don't know before, right?
Right. 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 And it's kind of pointless to argue at that point. That
Right. And
that's
so,
that's that's over.
yeah, and then an angel appeared to her. So they're having these heavenly experiences, is what I guess I want to point out. They're having and they're worthy of them, right? I don't think that an angel just appears to anybody to tell. An angel didn't come to me to tell me the Book of Mormon was true.
Right.
I got my testimony through the Holy Ghost, which is perfectly fine. But what is it about these women that they're getting these heavenly experiences? They're essentially getting the same experiences as Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith had angels coming to him to teach him. They're getting the same experiences. What does this tell us about who these women are?
Well, I think it points to two things. One, you can't um just make the assumption here that these women are uneducated, which has been another slam on plural marriage for a long time, right? They're just uneducated. I mean, they don't know any better, right? They're not, maybe their mental prowess isn't there, and they can't do that. That doesn't seem to be the case because they all are intelligent, intellectual, as we're seeing here, as you quote them, articulate women who have done the homework, so to speak. The other thing I would say is I think even more than the intellectual capacity and honesty, there's got to be something deeper on the inside, right? A heart that's willing to accept truth, consequences be damned. You know what I mean? Just willing to
Yeah.
go for it.
Yep. And 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 that's why I think it's like, again, that's why I have the hardest time watching just this conversation about plural marriage when we don't talk about the women, because the women are the second half of the restoration.
Absolutely.
And I'm not a feminist. I'm not here to be like rah rah women's rights. I'm just here to say that women have an important role in the kingdom of God. That, like I said, they are the second half of the restoration. The restoration did not happen without these women.
Yeah.
We even go back to Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner. Well, who was she? She's the girl at 12 years old who saves the Book of Commandments. So
Okay.
we tell, right, we tell that story in church history, and she saves the Book of Commandments. She's 12. She takes the manuscript and she runs from the mob and hides, and she saves the Book of Commandments. Well, because she is of such a character that she prized the revelations of God
Right.
enough to risk her life to preserve them and to save them.
Absolutely. And you said something very interesting there, that women are the second half of the restoration. Um, that's a big statement, but yet I'm not sure that even does it real justice, right? Because from a very practical standpoint, I can testify that this whole thing as far as plural marriage and that sort of stuff, it falls apart if women are not amenable to it, right? If they do not have a burning testimony of it. And so this idea that they were duped or they were just kind of tricked into it, that doesn't hold water either. Because the truth always comes out, no matter what. It always comes out. And if this was just a Joseph thing, if this was just, hey, he's got a cult of personality, right? He's really smooth. That's going to wear off when he's dead, right? And they have other viable options, but yet still choose this. So the idea that they're just duped, that doesn't hold water.
Right. Not when you start to read their testimonies. And that's why I can see why Michelle Brady Stone, she runs from the women's testimonies. She doesn't want to talk about them. She pretends they don't exist. She pretends they're not there. And when you do point out any like well, I was having a conversation with her one day just online. Obviously, she doesn't we don't talk in person.
You
We
don't
don't
hang
like
out.
talk.
You don't like do.
Right.
You don't have lunch dates. I'm shocked. I don't know what to say,
Right.
Kimberly.
I don't know why. We'd get along great. No, just kidding. But I was pointing out, I'm like, well, what about Elizabeth Whitney? She's the mother of Sarah Ann Whitney, who was a playwright to Joseph Smith, and she wrote her an autobiography, and she related the experience of Joseph Smith teaching their family plural marriage and then her giving her daughter in marriage to the prophet Joseph Smith. What about that? And you could not believe the just the mental gymnastics. She went from everything to that's a forgery to oh, she was forced to write that. Like I'm like, okay, you can infer that, right? You can say that all you want and you can even believe it. But where's the evidence?
Right. Right. And that's the part that drives me nuts, right? Because look, we do have record of women leaving plural marriage that they weren't a fan of it, right? Even some of Brigham's wives just leave because they're not a fan of it. That's cool. You do you, right? I mean, whatever it takes. But in the absence of any other evidence to just call it a forgery, where's your proof? Where's your proof that it's a forgery? I've heard the claims. Michelle Brady Stone is really good at making claims, but she stinks on ice when it comes time to back those claims up. And that's something I'm willing to go to the mat on here on this one because she really is like, okay, look, at this point, I can't even say she's just horribly mistaken. We're crossing into lines now that quite frankly are just lies. And that is the most disturbing part to me, is just the willingness to just continue to lie about it, knowing you got to know at this point that it's the stuff she's saying is false. When the only thing she can do is claim that it's a forgery and not produce any evidence that it is a forgery, it should fall on deaf ears at that point.
Yeah, it's just frustrating because obviously that's what people want to hear. Okay, I can dismiss this woman because Michelle said it's a forgery. But what I really liked what have you ever read the book or are you aware of the book, The Women of Mormondom?
Yes, I have read excerpts. I haven't went all the way through, but I'll be honest with you, when I want to get inside, I shouldn't say get inside the mind of, but understand what Joseph was really talking about, I tend to go to that one because there is a lot in there. And just like all men do, we confide in our wives, right? They are absolutely the ones we go to when things get the toughest. And there are a lot of nuggets from Joseph Smith in that book.
It is phenomenal. I keep it by the side of my bed. I refer to it often. I love that book. And I loved what's his name? Edward Toolage. He's the author, and he did write that under the direction of Eliza R. Snow, and the women did have input because obviously this is a history of their lives. But I really liked what he said in the introduction. He said the record of their lives, speaking about the women, is now sent unto you, that you may have an opportunity to judge them in the spirit of righteousness. So shall you be judged by him whom they have honored, whose glory they have sought, and whose name they have magnified. And so I don't care if you disagree with these women, but you cannot judge them in the spirit of righteousness if you have not listened to their testimonies and their witnesses of what they knew to be true. So for Michelle to just claim that was a forgery, she was trauma bonded, she was forced to do this, she was lying, she cannot do that in the spirit of righteousness if she does not even acknowledge that these testimonies exist, that these women left a record of their testimony, that we don't, they're not just affidavits that were signed that don't have their real signatures, that they are actual witness statements from the women, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. 100%. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, and so I just yeah, again, it's about I think we have a duty and a responsibility to seek out these testimonies, to seek out what the women said.
Right.
Um, okay, so just going on, because I really do want to get to Eliza R. Snow because, as we know, she's the most celebrated woman in Mormon history for good reason. But I really like what she taught us in her testimony of plural marriage. Because she said, and again, you listen to her as she grew in knowledge. And again, she's like any other woman where she's first introduced to the practice and she recorded in her journal. She said, the subject was very repugnant to my feelings.
Mm.
This is just a natural reaction. And I love that
Sure.
these women are honest. So she goes on to write, though. She says, but later, after growing in her understanding of the principle through the instruction of the Holy Ghost, she wrote, quote, as I increased in knowledge concerning the principle and the design of plural marriage, I grew in love with it and today esteem it as a precious, sacred principle.
Wow. That's
And
interesting. Does she ever have like because we saw with Lucy Walker Smith and Desdemona Fulmer that they kind of have heavenly visitations, right? Does Eliza? Because she seems to say through the spirit, right? And I'm fascinated with the different mechanism there.
yeah, so well, I'll do so in her testimony, she doesn't ever allude to that, but I did want to share an experience that she had after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. Um, so before I get to that, I just wanted to, if I could just finish reading her testimony.
Sorry about that.
Oh no, you didn't jump. I just wanted to finish reading it because,
Sure.
like I said, what they say in these testimony again is teaching us something about the order of heaven, right? And
Right.
so she goes on to say, she grows in the knowledge, she increases in knowledge. So I will say this. So like where other women say they had these heavenly visions and they had angels coming to him, she's saying that she increases in knowledge through the spirit. So she's learning line upon line, precept upon precept, kind
Right.
of like how we're supposed to learn.
Yep.
So I love that too, that here's a different experience where she doesn't get the heavenly vision that we know of, because she doesn't say that, but she still increases in knowledge of
Yeah.
it. So she's being taught throughout her life. And so I love that. And so she said, in Nauvoo, I first understood the practice of plurality of wives was to be introduced in the church. The subject was very repugnant to my feelings. And then she goes on to say, but when I reflected that I was living in the dispensation of the fullness of times, embracing all other dispensations, surely plural marriage must necessarily be included. So again, this idea that these women were educated in the Bible.
Right.
He's saying, well, if this is the fullness of times, and we know that it happened anciently, it must be part
Uh,
of
yeah.
history.
It's got to come back.
Mhm.
There's no if Abraham practiced that in faithfulness, which I believe he did, if if um, we know that David had problems, but plural marriage doesn't seem to be one of them. I believe Moses was living that principle as well. We know that he did it in righteousness. So it's got to be a true principle. And if it's a true principle, and then going on to say that this is the dispensation of the fullness of times, it's got to make a return. It has
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. And so another highlight of her testimony, again, I think this speaks to the character of the women. She says, "It was not long, however, after I received this first intimation, before the announcement reached me that the set time had come, that God had commanded his servants to establish the order by taking additional wives. I knew that God was speaking."
Mm.
So there, to me, what stands out to me, and then you can tell me well, first tell me what stands out to you in that last part of her testimony.
She seems to get something that it's made known to her that, quote, the set time had arrived, right? That she is somehow privy to something that maybe others weren't. That was the thing that jumped out to me on that. And that she had heard it from the voice of God himself, right? She said that she heard that voice. Now, what mechanism is that? Is that from the pulpit as Joseph is preaching? Is that a a her hearing a voice and some of her quiet reflection or meditation or prayer? I'm not sure, but it seems to be that she has some idea that this is coming, and then that quote set time had arrived, almost like she was being prepared, right? And then also hearing the voice of God somehow.
Yes, and she said she knew that it was God that was speaking. And what I liked about that is because I think often there's a scripture, and I'm probably going to butcher it, where it says, how doth a man know a master he has not served," or something.
Right,
And so I'm like, if she recognized the voice of God, it's because she has been serving God.
right,
She's not just she's not just this sinner who was converted to Christianity. She's
right.
not a Christian converted to the Book of Mormon. She is a woman that knows God.
Yeah,
She knows his voice. She knows the scriptures. She understands the role of Joseph Smith in restoring the fullness of the dispensation of times.
right.
So, and again, if we want to understand the restoration, why would we not go to those men and women who knew,
Absolutely.
right? They weren't just like, oh, I don't know what's going on here as these things are happening.
No,
They're see
they're seeing and experiencing, right? Especially the wives of Joseph. They're the experiences that they're having are beyond just seeing, right? They are understanding at a much deeper level what is
yeah,
happening here, which again, and I want to say this too, right? Oftentimes in Christendom, up until quite frankly, Joseph Smith, the idea was, well, the world's the way it is because Eve screwed up, right? This flies in the face of that, right? This is on par, in my opinion, with the Savior showing up, and it'd be a conversation for a later day. We can talk about why that is, but it's on par with the Savior showing up first to announce himself to a woman, right after his resurrection. Um, it's putting women back in their proper um elevated station, in my opinion, within the gospel. And it's showing how God feels about his daughters, and that they're not what Christendom had painted them to be as the bane of of this existence because Eve ate the fruit.
exactly. And yeah, like they're restoring women to their
Yep.
high holy positions as priestesses and prophetesses,
Yep.
um, queens and priestess unto God. And so a lot of people, there's a lot of accusations made against Eliza R. Snow that she's part of this push to, you know, convince women to lie and um, part of, Brigham Young's cabal. And I just take such great offense because of who Eliza R. Snow is as a woman. She even said that plural marriage did not hurt her. Um, she said polygamy did not hurt me, but to be looked upon as a woman of light character did hurt me. The very idea of my not being a virtuous woman.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can see that she's what was worse to her. Like the plural marriage was, wasn't
Kind of the
this
least of her concerns, right? She has a good grasp on it. Um,
right.
let me ask you this about Eliza R. Snow. Does she ever have children?
No, she does not have children.
That's
And
it.
and there's I think there's pretty good history to back up the fact that she was gang raped.
Mm,
And so I think that left her unable to have children. And because when we talk about I always say the part of history that's whitewashed is the part that we don't tell of what really happened when the Saints were driven out of Missouri.
yeah.
And
Yep.
we whitewashed the fact that women were raped, gang raped,
Absolutely. Yep.
children were raped,
Yep.
men were raped.
Yep.
And that's the part we whitewashed. And so unfortunately, I think that she experienced that and was unable to conceive children. I know there's a story of supposedly Emma throwing her down the stairs that she was pregnant, but she never writes about that in her journal. So if she doesn't write about it, I think that either it didn't happen or she just didn't want us to know that. So I
Gotcha.
I personally I don't propagate that
Correct.
story because
Correct.
it doesn't come from her. So
Yep.
and I think if anyone, she should be the one to tell it if it happened, and she
Right.
doesn't tell it. So
Sure.
I just don't give that any credence. So
Sure.
but I do also want to point out that again, I've heard a lot of excuses that people make that she was just sealed to Joseph and it wasn't a marriage, but she does say, quote, I was sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith for time and eternity in accordance with the celestial law of marriage, which God had revealed, the ceremony being performed by a servant of the Most High, authorized to officiate in sacred ordinances. This, one of the most important events of my life, I have never caused to regret.
Wow.
Yep. And she writes of Joseph Smith saying, he's my beloved husband, the choice of my heart, and the crown of my life.
I have another question, and this is just me wondering because I haven't been able to find anything here. What's her relationship with Brigham like? Because I know she marries Brigham later, right? Do we get an idea of what their marital life was like? I mean, were they close? I mean, Brigham had a lot of wives, right? And on some level, I almost get the sense that this is the way that Brigham is honestly taking care of a lot of single women, right? Do we know what their relationship was like at all? Do we have anything from her journals that give us any insight there?
Oh, absolutely. So, this is an interesting dynamic. Again, a lot of people like to make up things about Eliza R. Snow, but what we do know, just from the writings in Brigham Young's, she was married to Brigham Young, but I don't get the sense that it was a conjugal relationship.
That's what I got too, but I was curious if you found anything to the contrary.
So we do know that she lived in the Lion House. That's what it was called, right? The Lion House. Um,
Mhm.
sorry. So we do know that she lived in there, but she takes an interesting role where she's kind of like a counselor to Brigham Young.
Okay.
So she's kind of like almost like in Brigham Young's writings, you see how he's like, okay, we're gonna establish the first Deseret, hospital. but I'm not going to do it unless Eliza Snow agrees to, basically be on the board
Interesting.
because she is, and this is going, and I'm going to tell you why. So when we get, this is the experience I wanted to share with you, and I think this is going to give us a sense of why. Because after the death of Joseph Smith, she becomes so distraught. And this actually speaks to her closeness to Joseph Smith because she becomes so distraught that she begins praying night and day for God to like let her die. Like she does not want to live
Wow.
anymore. She's like, I can't, I'm in grief. I can't live without my husband, which tells us that they had an intimate relationship.
They did. Yep.
I mean, she did live in his house for a time. She was, we know that she did teach his children.
Mhm.
But so she goes on to say that, so then she has a dream and she's visited by Joseph Smith in a dream. And she said that God has plans for you. He said, Joseph told her that this work upon the earth was, that his work upon the earth was completed as far as the mortal tabernacle was concerned, but hers was not. The Lord desired her, and so did her husband, to live many years and to assist in carrying on the great latter-day work which Joseph had been chosen to establish.
Wow.
Um, yeah. And so after that, ever since then, it appears that she was consoled by that, and she let go of her loneliness and her bereavement, and she resigned her life to serving God. And so we see that in her life, right? We see that she carries on the Relief Society. She spends her life working in the endowment house, administering the endowment. She's establishes the Relief Society. She goes and she travels throughout the Utah Territory, establishing the Relief Society in the different wards. She gives of her life for the establishment of the work of God, right? So she completes the work that Joseph had begun. And the Relief Society was an important part of the kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah. No, look, I know Brigham suspended it for a time, right? And for reasons that we can get in another time, but he does reinstitute it and it does begin to function much the same way that Joseph had. Um, and there's some interesting stuff concerning women in the priesthood that come out of some of those early Utah period accounts of
Mhm.
Relief Society. One last thing I wanted to point out here that I just found absolutely interesting, and I think it speaks not so much to just women, but to the human condition in general. I look at what happens to Eliza R. Snow in Missouri, right? Horrific. Um, and then I look at someone like Margaret Sanger, who something very similar happened to her in her childhood. And it's interesting how I think we all go through times in our lives, hopefully never to that extreme. Most of us won't have to ever think about that. But when faced with that, we have choices as a human being, right? We can either decide to wallow in that darkness, and that, look, in the case of Margaret Sanger, it's still happening today.
Mhm.
Thousands of deaths of the most innocent. Or Eliza R. Snow, who says, I'm going to throw myself into the work of God in service of my fellow brothers and sisters. And I find it a very fascinating comparison because they go through similar things, but they end up so far apart in
Yeah.
what they use on that.
Wow. I didn't know that about Margaret Singer. So that, yeah, that is,
Oh,
it's,
don't look into Sanger. I did that once and went down that rabbit hole, and that was horrific. Don't do that. That's
yeah, just a stark contrast for sure. And the thing about Eliza is I want to point out is like you brought up the women in the priesthood, and so Eliza Snow, what makes the Relief Society successful is because she in Nauvoo, she's the secretary of the Relief Society. So she had kept all the minutes and she carried those across the plains. And so the only reason we have the teachings of Joseph Smith to the Relief Society today is because of Eliza R. Snow. So without Eliza R. Snow, there would be no Relief Society. We
Right.
would not know what Joseph Smith was teaching the women. And what's interesting to me too, so we're talking about Eliza Snow's kind of like a counselor to Brigham Young. She kind of fills that role. And you see what you see in Eliza's life is that actually she's humble and she's submissive and she's obedient to the righteous counsel of the priesthood. And that is actually how she gains her gifts of the Spirit. And she has, so for example, just read a few excerpts from her journal where she talks about, so again, she says, hold on, let me get to it. She says, on June 2nd, 1847, I spent the afternoon with Lucy in company of Zina, Louisa, and Emily. Emily and myself spoke in the gift of tongues. On June 3rd of that year, she said, Sister Sessions, Kimball, Whitney, and myself spent the evening at Sarah Ann's, had a powerful time. Deep things were brought forth which were not to be spoken.
Ooh,
Yeah.
to be a fly on that wall.
Yeah. So you see, these gifts of the Spirit, this priesthood, because she's ordained, she has her second anointing, she's ordained a priestess, she's ordained a queen in the priestess. Whereas in the LDS church today, we're only ordained to become such.
Right.
So she becomes a priestess and a prophetess of the restoration. And then at another time, she said on June 6th, she says, a time of blessing at Sister Kimball's, Sister Sessions, and myself blessed Helen. So here we see them exercising the gift of healing, and they're laying their heads upon the women. And she said, I spoke and she interpreted. I then blessed the girls in a song, singing to each in rotation.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
You
So
know,
the you see the gift of,
oh, go ahead, finish. I'm sorry.
oh, I was just gonna just say the gift of prophecy and tongues were like they're very familiar to these women.
Absolutely. The other thing that this brings out, right? Because let's face it, the favorite whipping boy of Stone and that and those who align with her is Brigham Young, right? That's who they love to flog more than anybody else. Um, but and one of the things they level is he's so misogynistic, right? That's one of the things I hear get tossed around really frequently. That's a tough accusation to make if he's essentially counseling with Eliza R. Snow on things. And he's saying, "Look, I'm not touching this hospital project unless she's on the board." Right? That's not a misogynistic guy. I'm sorry. It's just not. That's a guy and there's other things there. And that's some of those stories that need to be told, right? Because not only do we get a sense of just how amazing these women were and how spiritually gifted they were and how important they are to the restoration. But they also, by their own voice, testify of who these early leaders of the church were.
Yeah, and I've always said, and I always try to help people understand that under the ordained leadership of Brigham Young, these women flourished.
Yep.
It wasn't just Eliza R. Snow on the board, it was an all-women board.
Right.
And these women flourished. Not only did they did they start the hospital and run it, Brigham Young is sending women back east to go to
Yep.
med school. I mean,
Yep.
we hear of women becoming midwives, but he was sending them to become doctors. He's encouraging women to become, he's like, study accounting. You can become better businessmen than your husbands. He's encouraging them to go into politics.
Martha
The
Hughes
women start,
Cannon, right?
yeah,
Beats her own husband, right?
yeah.
Now, the fallen side of me wishes I could have heard what her husband what kind of raft he got from some of the guys in his ward when that death settled. But yeah, you're a spot on.
Yeah, and I do want to get to the women's exponent because this is very, very important. So the women, they start the women's exponent. This is a woman's journal. Like in all of Christendom, do you ever hear of a woman having their own journal, their own writings?
Nope.
Um, and so you have Eliza R. Snow is an editor, and Emmeline B. Wells. And what do you even know why the Women's Exponent was started?
I don't.
It was started because of all of the anti-polygamy sediment. We have not just the RLDS missionaries coming to convince they're trying to convert members to go back to Nauvoo, but then you have there were organizations that were starting in Utah that from non-members that were they were jealous of the Relief Society and they saw the influence that women had in Utah. And so they tried to start their own organization to rival the Relief Society. And so they started what they called this anti-polygamy standard, where the women, and these are non-Mormon women, they started collecting these anonymous affidavits to slander Utah polygamist women. So it's really fascinating that they get together and they start the Women's Exponent. And this was like in 1972. I want to get the exact date. So I think it's June 1st, or sorry, 1872. I don't know what I said.
You said it's okay. We knew what you meant.
Okay, sorry. I'm like,
No, you're good. You're good.
okay, and I am so fascinated. So this is what, and another thing that gets me is again, the leading voices in the anti-polygamy movement do not talk about the Women's Exponent. They do not want you to know about the Women's Exponent because so Helen Mar Kimball, another poor wife of Joseph Smith, she now she's I'm not going to stand for this. I am going to use my pen and I am going to use it to basically raise my voice. And so she's in defense of plural marriage. And so she writes, this is what she writes. She says, the conflict, so she's speaking about all these people that are now persecuting these polygamous women
Hmm.
and slandering them and trying to make them look like, they are oppressed and they're ignorant and they're in this horrible system of plural marriage. And she writes, the conflict is between them and our God, who has never forsaken his people, but he does not expect us to sit quietly down and fold our hands in idleness while our enemies are publishing their outrageous falsehoods to blind the eyes of the weak and credulous to the most glorious truths of heaven and to throw ignominy and dishonor upon our people, as our slanderers are on the road to perdition, but to use every honorable means to defend ourselves against their vile attacks.
I love that fire. That love that fire.
I love it so much. And so they start the Women's Exponent, and it's a woman's journal. This is where the women they come out and they're like, I'm publishing my testimony, I'm publishing my witness. I was taught plural marriage by Joseph Smith, and I want the world to know. And they're publishing this to the world. Every week, something goes out from these women.
Whew.
And so these aren't women that are oppressed. These aren't women that are being coerced and forced.
Right, right. No, look, they're taking to heart what it says in the DNC that you should be actively engaged in a good cause, right? And I
Mhm.
can imagine that I don't know for certain. You probably have more information on that than I do. To me, this sounds kind of like a grassroots movement among those group of sisters, right? Um, and let's face it, and I've said this for a while too, right? You will never you will never catch me trying to tell a woman how great plural marriage is because it's kind of a bad look, right? And I'm a dude,
Right.
right? And people are going to be like, well, of course you're for it, right? There is something more potent when women step up to make that claim. It is more potent. Because it's their voice, not not the dudes.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that listening again, she's just the leading voice. So we've got to call it out because she's the leading voice. Michelle Brady Stone is the leading voice against these women, and it's interesting to me that she uses the anti-polygamy standard to basically convince her audience, look how bad plural marriage is. That anti-polygamy standard was started by women who weren't even members of the church.
Right.
And they were attacking the women in Utah. So again, this is, like Michelle's all about women empowerment. She's all about feminism. And here she is using women who aren't even her religion, that aren't even members of the church, that are writing anonymous affidavits, slandering Utah women, and trying to distort uh, people's perceptions of plural marriage.
Right.
That's what she uses as sources. And it's just so frustrating. Instead of going to the women's exponent and saying, well, what did the women say to defend themselves? What did they teach in the women's exponent?
Yeah, look, in her quest, as you put it, to make sure that women's empowerment has a place in Mormonism and feminism and all those other things. Um, she has to discredit other women, right? And to me, that's the insane part of the whole thing, right? Is that to get where you want to go, you've got to step over women and their testimonies and what they believed was true. It
Exactly.
just doesn't hold water, and it's despicable on some level.
Yep. And Dave, I know we're getting close to 2 hours, but there's just two things I want to share.
Take all the time you need. I only put 2 hours down there because I got to put something on the invite. So you take whatever time you need, Kimberly.
Okay, because again, I want to make sure again, cannot be comprehensive. That if if anyone's interested in learning more about these women, I'm happy to point them in the right direction and give them, resources and places they can look. But so there's just two really important things I want to hopefully represent tonight. So not only the Women's Exponent, which I think is a huge source for the women's testimonies, like major, like um, I'll just give you one example of someone who wrote in to give her testimony. And her name is Helen M. Callister. So she's not even a woman that, that is noteworthy or, one of those prominent women. She's just your average Latter-day Saint who's living her religion. And she writes in and she says, to raise my voice in public has ever been a source of much embarrassment to my sensitive nature. Indeed, I always feel my inability to address even my sisters in this capacity, but duty and justice demand that my voice should now be heard, and would that my words of faith in defense of my religion might re-echo and find accordance in every heart of every true-hearted woman. And then she goes on to say, I know the principle of plural marriage to be a truth. I have lived in polygamy for the last 33 years and was among the first to enter into that sacred principle.
Ooh,
Yeah.
this,
So,
oh, I can kind of identify with that voice, right? Not wanting to do it, right? Not your thing, but the times call for it now. You don't get to just stay on the sidelines any longer. Now you got to get in the game.
yeah, and that's why I wish in this discussion we would let the women speak. Let them and so people can actually decide. So if you're going to have a debate about plural marriage, you have Michelle's voice, Michelle Brady Stone, again, because she's the leading voice. She's made herself a public figure. She claims to represent the women, but then let people hear their voice so they can decide which voice they're going to follow. Whose testimony are they going to believe? And so that's just, again, my frustration is that not very many people have heard these testimonies. And then something I think is of noteworthy to add is that if we haven't heard enough of the women in the women's exponent on January 6, 1870, do you know what happened on that date?
Enlighten me, please.
So there was this mass meeting of women. It was called the Great Indignation Meeting, and 5,000 women, Mormon women, came to sign a petition to protest a government bill that would make polygamy in Utah illegal.
Wow. So the women showed up for it.
5,000 Mormon women lined the streets of Utah to sign a petition to protest a government bill which was going to make polygamy illegal. If you are oppressed, if polygamy is such this horrible system, and Brigham Young is a tyrant, church leaders are tyrants, wouldn't you welcome this government bill to make it illegal?
Yeah. Yeah, it's your perfect out, right? If you are in bondage, you don't even have to take responsibility for being set free. You can just be like, "Sorry, dude, not my doing." If I'd say, but the government says, we got to be done with this. Instead, well, and here's the other fascinating thing. I'm just thinking about the numbers in 1870, right? Saints show up in Utah in 47. So you're about 30 years, right? I'm guessing that not even all the women there are probably in the principal even, right? But there are women that probably are either aspiring to, or at least the very least, want to respect their sisters enough to be like, this is their choice. This is what they want. I'm here to support them. It's a fascinating moment in time where you hear the women's voice come through in defense of this.
Yeah, and what's fascinating too, again, we're talking about, women. This was a meeting of women. And so they sign this petition, and then they hold this, what they call the Great Indignation Meeting. It was this mass meeting. So you have, and again, so the federal government is involved. So you have major press there, press from, back east, everywhere. And they listen to these women as they gather together, and then they stand up on over the pulpit, and they begin to bear witness
Mm.
of their religious rights, their right to practice this principle, and then to bear witness of the principle. And I just wanted to give this testimony of this woman. Her name is, she doesn't give her first name. It's Mrs. Wilmarth East. So she's going by her husband's name, Mrs. Wilmarth East. She gets up in this meeting and she says, this is what she says. I am thankful today that I have had the privilege of living the religion of Jesus, our Savior. I am thankful today that I have the honored privilege of being the happy recipient of one of the greatest principles ever revealed to man for his redemption and exaltation in the kingdom of God, namely plurality of wives. And I am thankful today that I know God is at the helm and will defend his people.
Whew. Man. And it's just tossed out. It's never revisited. That kind of passion is never given its due. These women don't ever get their, quite frankly, the recognition that they deserve, right? Look, it's one thing to do it today. I don't want to lessen that or cheapen that at all. It's a hard way of life. Not always, right? I don't want it to seem like it's miserable. Um, I know, again, women are free to leave, right? Just as the men are. Um, but they're doing it in a time when it's brand new, right? This is the first time en masse that this principle's attempted to being lived again. And they don't even they don't even have the gift of anonymity at this point, right? If you live in Utah in the 1870s, everybody knows, right? From San Francisco to New York, everybody knows what's happening. And it shows an extreme amount of intestinal fortitude to stand up at this time and bear testimony like that. And for those, in the polygamy denial camp to just toss those aside, it's despicable. And quite frankly, and these are my words, not yours. You're kind of a despicable human being if you can just toss this aside.
Yeah, and toss it aside, especially given the fact that these women made incredible sacrifices.
Yeah.
Like, and Zina D. Huntington, she said, she even mentions, because you're like you said, that there's no anonymity, sorry,
It's
at
all right.
this
I
point.
struggled with it too.
She said, I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved. How could I compromise conscience and lay aside the sure testimony of the Spirit of God for the glory of this world?
Wow.
Yeah.
Someone needs to write a book about this, right? Like just following it. I mean, I'm going to say something now that may it'll get me in some trouble, but that's okay. I'm used to those waters. This might really be the first suffrage movement for women in America. I can't think of another one before this. Um, and this time it's a movement to just let them practice their religion and live what to the dictates of their own conscience in a marital practice that the rest of the world abhors.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that that's what Joseph Smith gave his life for.
Yep.
He gave his life. He wanted everybody to be free to live their religion.
Yep. Yep.
And now modern Latter-day Saints are turning on the the founders of their own religion and trying to defame them and shame them and bring dishonor upon them for living their religion, living what was their conscience, what they testify came from God. So it's just frustrating to me. I don't even have the right words. It's heartbreaking. It actually does bring me a lot of sadness, actually.
Does that sadness come from a place of just watching these women's words and their emotion and their passion just being tossed aside? Is that where
Yeah,
the sadness comes from?
because I feel like, I was born in the church, but I didn't I guess I feel like I'm in a position where I was born kind of in a family that was inactive, and I come from a broken home. I had divorced parents. I lost my mother at a young age, and so I wanted the gospel, I was looking for that eternal family. I was looking for, like it said, what these women sacrificed for. I wanted the power and the authority, and I wanted the eternal families. And so I fought really hard for it. I fought to, gain my testimony. I fought to try to live the gospel the best I could so I could marry in the temple. And then I see all of these, Latter-day Saints not only born in the covenant, but are literal descendants of these men and women. There's Brigham Young descendants that are turning on him. There's,
Right.
John Taylor descendants that are saying, "Oh, how I'm ashamed of my ancestor for living plural marriage." And they, because I feel like I was blessed with this gospel and this covenant
Right.
because they made that sacrifice. How
Absolutely.
can I turn on them? And so it brings me sadness to see these Latter-day Saints not value what they have
Right.
and the heritage they're part of.
I'm right there with you. As a first generation Mormon ever, there's times I just watched the one where there was a descendant of Brigham Young who was, really coming hard after him. And I'm like, if you don't like your place in that family, can I have it? Because I'd kind of kill for, to go back a ways in the restored gospel, right? Um, it is sad. And it's quite frankly on par with what we're dealing with today, right? It is an unhinging of of good history, true history, and an embracing of lies and falsehoods and all things that are fake.
And is exactly right. So I'm just like, okay, for example, what does Michelle Brady Stone have to offer you? Does like so these women, I feel like we through these women we've inherited this covenant. What do you inherit from Michelle Brady Stone? Like, what does she offer you? Like, instead of Mormonism, what do you get? what covenant do you get?
Right?
What priesthood do you get? Like, what at the end of the day, what is she offering you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And here's I lately I've been studying a lot on unintended consequences, right? Um, I look back at World War One. You know, they just decimate Germany with sanctions for the First World War. Well, what's the unintended consequence of that? Well, eventually you cause hunger in Germany, which leads to a guy being able to stand up and say, "Follow me." And that leads to the Holocaust. Okay. That's an unintended consequence. Let's just game plan this out, right? What are the unintended consequences of espousing what Michelle Brady Stone is selling? It's this. You want to get rid of plural marriage? That's fine. But in order to do it, you got to get rid of 132. You get rid of 132, what's the unintended consequence? You get rid of eternal families, period. Right? That's not a thing anymore because the same revelation that outlines plural marriage is also the same revelation that outlines eternal families, sealings. And once you take that away, what do you got left? Well, and please, for those who are the Protestant faith that listen, don't take this as a slam because I don't mean it to be. But what you're left with is you're left with Protestantism with some really cool buildings and an additional book of scripture. That's what you got. Um,
Right.
the mysteries of godliness that can be revealed outside the temple. You know, I love the Book of Mormon. I do. I value that book. I read that book daily. But if you're looking for the mysteries of godliness in scripture outside the temple, that's only found in the Doctrine and Covenants. And especially once you get to the Nauvoo period, right? And all the writings of Joseph Smith. So if you want to detach from that, understand there's consequences to be had in doing that. You will get rid and you will gut out of Mormonism anything uniquely Mormon, and you will be left with Protestantism with a really cool book and some really extravagant buildings. It's what you got.
Right. No power, no authority, no priesthood.
Nope.
So we know in the Bible that Jesus Christ said, I am the vine and you are the branches. And then, he talks about he's explaining that relationship between himself and his followers. And he's basically saying that, if you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But then he says, if you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers.
Right.
And I really that if we can end on this high note because Eliza Snow, she writes this poem called The Tree
Oh,
of Life.
can I, because I got just two questions I want to ask you before we wrap up,
Okay.
and then I want to hear that poem. But first, I need to ask these two questions. One,
Okay.
why haven't we ever read about these women, these early women in Mormonism? Right? Why is it that they have not been featured more prominently within Mormon circles? And I'm not just pointing at the LDS Church, I'm pointing in general at all expressions of the restoration. Why are we not hearing this more?
That is a good question. And that is my frustration, to be honest. Like I know that a year ago or whatever, you had Hannah Stoddard on your podcast talking
Mhm.
about the Helen Mar Kimball book. And I think that was the reason why, she started out wanting to write about these women is because we women need heroes.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of scriptural examples, of men, and I'm by no means a feminist. So um, I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying, but women need heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Women need good examples of what true womanhood look like, what does it mean to be a mother in Zion, and so I don't know what we need we need to tell the stories of these women because
Yeah.
they forged the path for us.
Right.
They laid the foundation of the kingdom of God, and without them, for women, there is no kingdom.
Without them, there's no kingdom for a man. Just that's what it is. We look, that's we can't dudes can't get there by themselves, right? Women can't get
Yeah,
there by themselves, right? You want to quote equalize the sexes? Welcome to Mormonism. We've been doing it for a while. Um, even with icky plural marriage, as some people like to look at it,
mhm.
right? It's absolutely an equalization. Neither gender, and newsflash, there really is only two. Neither gender can get to where they want to go without each other. Period.
Exactly. I mean that's the capstone of the restoration, right? Is the
Yep.
eternal marriage, joining of the sexes. So, and that's the kingdom.
Yep.
A man cannot attain the fullness of the priesthood without the woman, and then the woman with the man, she obtains the fullness of the priesthood. She becomes a queen and a priestess in the fullness of the priesthood in God's kingdom. She is a queen and a priestess to rule and reign over the house of Israel. And so without any yeah, I would love it if there's some talented men or women out there, preferably women that want to take this project on and study the life of one of these women and write a book about her. I think that would just we need that actually.
Hey,
We need these women need women. And I believe that with all my heart. I as a woman myself, I it just I there's no one for me to look to in modern society that I can say this is what a godly woman looks like. This is what a holy woman looks like. I want to be like her. But we have those examples and so they need to be lifted up so we can see them and we can learn from them. Yeah. So, I do love that in the early days of the church, when these women were entered into these covenants and they were given their patriarchal blessings, um, I was just going to read one of the women were told, she said, the, one of the women was told, "Thou shalt be numbered among the mothers in Israel, for thou shalt have knowledge by which thou shalt teach the daughters of Zion how to live."
wow.
Yeah, so these are the examples. These are when we think of the millennium and who's going to reign in the millennium, who is going to be by Joseph Smith's side?
His wives.
His wives. And so at some point or another, you're going to have to, if you want to be in Zion, you have to accept the fact that Joseph Smith is going to be there with his wives.
Right. Absolutely.
And then he'll be
Absolutely.
having children with these women, and you're going to have to accept the fact that it's these other women having children with Joseph Smith.
That it's a fully functional marriage. Um,
Yes.
yep, absolutely. Okay, let me ask you this question, and this one's a little more personal. But as you, because you come in from a place, as you noted, that you weren't necessarily your family may have been Mormon by birth, but you guys weren't necessarily practicing, right?
Mhm.
Did you ever struggle with the polygamy thing? Did you ever look at it and kind of wither and say, "Oh man, that's rough. I don't want to look at that."
So I really apologize. I know that some women might not like my answer,
Okay.
but I'm just going to be honest.
Okay.
So I, again, because I feel like I had to fight basically for a testimony and I had to search it out because it wasn't like I was being handed the gospel at home. And so I wanted to know everything about my religion. So I studied early on, like in high school. Read the history of the church. I read the scriptures. I read Doctrine and Covenants 132, and that actually became my favorite scripture. And so, in my mind, I'm like, okay, that happened. There was a reason for it. The church doesn't live it now, so I don't have to worry about it. And then I just left it alone, and it didn't bother me.
Okay.
until about 2000, I want to say 12, 13, between about the years 2012 and 2015, I had a really, really, really strong prompting and impression from the Spirit that if I wanted a strong and lasting testimony of the gospel, of the restoration, I needed to have a testimony of every single revelation that came through Joseph Smith. And so I knew that I had to gain a testimony for myself that plural marriage was true,
Okay.
that it was a revelation that came from God. I didn't just have like a knowledge that it happened, right? I before it was just like, yeah, I know that it happened historically. I had to gain that witness for myself.
Gotcha. Did it,
And
oh, sorry, go ahead, finish.
no, go ahead.
Did it scare you when you got that prompting? Did you ever feel in bondage to that fear?
I wasn't scared. I was just wondering, I'm like, okay, so and it turned out to a little bit be prophetic, right? Because I I had no idea what was coming down the pike. What was coming? An attack on plural marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Plural marriage is being used as a like I've said it before, a theological weapon against the church. It's being used as a theological weapon against the restoration, against the character of Brigham Young and John Taylor. And had I not gained that testimony when I did and listened to that prompting, I might be a polygamy denier right now.
Right, right,
And I feel like it was a blessing. And so I wasn't afraid of it. And and the thing is, again, what happens when you gain a testimony? When you gain a witness by the Spirit, I can testify like these women, it brings you peace.
right.
God helps you to understand it that when you have knowledge, you have power. It brings peace and joy. And I'm not like again, I'm a mainstream member. I have I live in monogamy. I'm not saying I'm looking forward to living polygamy. I'm not saying I can't wait to die and go to the celestial kingdom and have and live polygamy. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that having an understanding that this revelation came from God and that the men and women of the restoration were men and women of honor and integrity and lived the commandments and were obedient to every word that proceeded out of the mouth of God, that gave me hope.
Okay,
It cemented my testimony that the restoration it is the foundation of the kingdom of God and it's solid.
right. Absolutely. And that's what I think the big takeaway should be on this, right? Is that don't trade one form of bondage, that of being scared of the doctrine, for another form of bondage, which is being ensnared in something that's blatantly false, that's peddled by people such as Michelle Brady Stone. Um, but rather wrestle with the truth. Wrestle with the truth because you will start by wrestling, and then at some point you will embrace it, right? What starts out as a tussle will end up as an embrace, but you got to put in the work, right? Just like you talked about, you got to put the work in. If you don't, if you do and you still walk away from it, hey, I get it. It's rough. And I don't bear judgment on anybody, man or woman, who shies away from it. It can be rough to think about and it's I get it. I understand it. But it doesn't mean it's not true. And just because
Right.
something challenges us doesn't mean it's not true. So,
Right. And I've tried to just share that with women that just having the knowledge that it came from God doesn't mean that you have to live it. Doesn't mean that God is then going to turn around and say, now you have to live this. It just means that then you have knowledge. Again, knowledge is power, that the restoration is actually true. That
absolutely.
Brigham Young is actually a prophet of God. That John Taylor is actually a prophet of God. That these women were actually holy consecrated women who loved the Lord, and they sacrificed everything to lay the foundation of the kingdom of God. And from them, we inherit the
Absolutely.
covenant. We
Absolutely.
inherit this covenant that we need, that we have to have in order to be saved.
Absolutely. All right. Those were my two questions. Um, let's go ahead and go to that poem because if it's the one I'm thinking of, it'll be a great place to wrap this all up.
Yeah, and I do want to wrap it up with this because it, again, Eliza R. Snow, she's the prophetess of the Restoration. She's actually was set apart by Joseph Smith in Nauvoo to be Zion's poetess.
Hmm.
And so through her poetry, this is where she reveals the doctrine.
Okay.
So this poem I think is so profound, and again, it ties in to what Jesus taught about I am the vine and you are the branches.
Okay.
So it's called the tree of life. And so she says, the tree of life's an emblem, one that shows the principle on which existence flows. The trunk, the center, issuing from the root, from which 12 branches bear 12 kinds of fruit.
Mm.
The root, the spring, the fountain, or the head, from which the spirit, life, light, knowledge spread, will unto him, the eternal God, compare, diffusing life and blessings everywhere. The trunk to Christ, who is the living vine, to whom as branches his apostles join, partake his spirit, and the fruit they bear is through their lineage scattered here and there.
Hmm.
So this is just the first part. So again, she's comparing, right? She's saying
Right.
this tree is Christ, and these branches are what his 12 apostles.
Yep.
So again, it's what he's saying. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you cut yourself off, you're going to wither and die.
Right.
If you stay in this trunk with, and again, with the 12 apostles, anciently and in the restoration, right? You're part of this tree, you're this vine, and you partake of spirit, life, light, knowledge, right? Then she goes on. This is the part I just think is so beautiful. So she goes on and she says, again, will thus compare the tree of life, the trunk, a husband, every branch a wife,
Mm.
grafted in him, the fruit posterity, partaking life and fatness from the tree. The leaves, the holy priesthood that will rest upon that fruit by lineal behest.
Wow.
And through the perfect laws of purity, will for the healing of the nations be. And thus will Joseph Brigham Heber too, and many more that practice as they do, as stems, as trunks, as heads, as centers stand, and spread their righteous branches over the land, through limb to limb be grafted on, until the spreading boughs shall all the garden fill. However far the utmost limbs extend, the trunk its sap through every fiber sends.
Wow.
Oh, and then, sorry, there was one more part. She
Oh, you're
says,
good.
Christ is the holy branch from Jesse's root. 'Twas said that from his roots a stem would shoot. From that same stem, the saviors will come forth on Mount and Zion's mount to sanctify the earth.
Ooh, allusions to temple work as well. Um, oh, there's a lot there that is absolutely beautiful. And the fact that she couples that with just stay true to the gospel, but also understand what a how big of a role celestial plural marriage plays in this, right? She goes on and I think it's a beautiful allegory where she talks about, the wives being grafted with the husbands and the posterity being the fruit and the priesthood being the leaves and leaves kind of protect that fruit and um yeah, and then makes allusions to, if I'm not mistaken, that last part there talks about kind of a lineage of the Savior, right? Standing as saviors on Mount Zion, temple work, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
we had a previous podcast where we talked about the reasons for plural marriage, and you did an excellent job in laying that out about preserving the posterity back to Adam, right? Um, you have to look at the whole picture to understand what's going on here. Because if you just say, well, it's just about multiple wives, well, yeah, it's going to be easy to get rid of at that point. But you have to understand the underpinnings of what's happening in the plan that the Lord has, or you're kind of doomed. You're kind of doomed to end up in Michelle Brady Stone's camp. I don't know how else to say it. You have to understand the doctrine. You have to understand what it was, what was being taught in conjunction with this practice. Period. It would be like doing temple work without understanding what vicarious work for the dead is. It would be pointless.
Right. And right, it's all about the priesthood. I remember, Jesus Christ said, I will make, the covenant that God made with Israel is that I will make you a nation of kings and priests.
Right?
That's a priesthood. How is the kingdom going to, how are we gonna how is the kingdom going to put all other nation, all other nations are going to be under the kingdom of God? How is that going to happen unless the priesthood is, like it says in that poem, it's going to extend throughout the whole world,
Right.
essentially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Kimberly, anything else you want to wrap up with?
The only thing I would just add again is that my hope for doing this podcast is I hope that when people listen to this, they just walk away with that eternal hope that, again, that the gospel is true, that the restoration is true, that temple ordinances are of God, and that they don't have to be afraid of the historical practice of plural marriage.
Absolutely.
And that because of the sacrifices of these women, we get to enjoy the fruits of the gospel.
Absolutely. I want to say just a few things here before we wrap up. And I want to make it abundantly clear that these are my words. They're not Kimberly's. There's nobody else's. If you're on the fence here and you're looking at Michelle Brady Stone and you're looking at Justin Griffin and you're looking at a host of polygamy deniers, and quite frankly, it's not. I think even that term, polygamy denier, doesn't tell the full story of what you're going to be up against. You are actively engaged in taking out the underpinnings of what the restoration is really all about. And it's not just plural marriage; it's sealings. It's all those things I alluded to in um in those unintended consequences of trying to get rid of this. Just know that the history is overwhelming that Joseph not only taught but practiced plural marriage. Overwhelming. You have to be, we are past, hey, is this a possibility? Questioning. We are now into you're lying. And if you ever wanted to know which side you'd be on in the Book of Mormon when Korihor came creeping around, this is your time to show it. Because if you fall for this enticing, and I get it, I've been through the ringer studying Mormonism and all the stuff that I perceived as problematic. I understand the the unsettling feelings that come, but I also understand the benefits of sticking with it and working through those things. And I'm not saying you're going to go my direction, right? I'm not telling anybody, "Oh, okay, now you understand, so just jump on the fundy train. We'll all go together." It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to understand it if you want to understand the gospel and the restoration as taught, as revealed by Joseph Smith. And
Mhm.
I hear a lot of people saying, gosh, how could people fall for that when Korihor came around? Well, here's your opportunity because Michelle Brady Stone is a Korihor. I don't know how else to put it. Justin Griffin is a Korihor. And And the people who lead out in that are absolutely a korihor. And they're preying, quite frankly, on some of the weakest of us. They rely on people having a faith crisis and then capitalizing on that faith crisis. And they also are using the same deplorable tactics that were used on the founding fathers, right? The left understood entirely. If you want to get rid of the Constitution, you have to progress past it. And the only way you can progress past it is by discrediting the founders. Now, they're not out and outright discrediting Joseph Smith. They're just painting you a very different picture of Joseph, who Joseph Smith is, one
Mhm.
that's not based in truth. And then they're out and out discrediting and attacking Brigham Young. So understand that if you're on the fence. And if you are on the fence and you're concerned and you don't know where to turn, go seek out those sources. Kimberly, is the book Women of Mormondom available today? Where do they find that?
I'm pretty sure you can still find it on Amazon, so it's
Okay.
definitely available. I think you can even get a PDF online.
Okay.
So if you don't want a hard copy, just Google Women of Mormondom and there's a
I'll
PDF.
I'll try to hunt that down and put it in the show notes on this episode. What about the Women's Exponent?
Um, it's yes, you can buy. You definitely can. Yes, it's called The Woman's View,
Okay.
and I think it was. I bought my copy off Amazon, so yeah, you can definitely get the
Okay.
Women's Exponent. I recommend I actually recommend all the poems by Eliza R. Snow. They were published. Someone's published them. Again, because she's teaching the doctrine. She's revealing the doctrine through poetry.
Right.
Um, so you can learn so much about the gospel through just reading her poems. Um, yeah, Helen Mar Kimball, Joseph Smith Foundation published the book um, a year or so ago. I recommend that book. I'm learning about Helen Mar Kimball because she is one of those voices of plural marriage, and she's actually a historian herself, Helen Mar Kimball. So she documents the history because she pretty much lived the history, right? She
Right.
grew up in the gospel. So she lived every major event in history. So she's definitely a source. Her journals are published. So yeah.
Awesome. Anything else before we wrap up, Kimberly?
No, I just appreciate this opportunity and I appreciate the conversation and I hope it's edifying to your listeners.
I'm sure it will be. I know my mind's blown every time we talk. Hang out for 5 minutes. I just got a few more things I want to go over with you.
Okay.
All right. Bye, everybody.